used to work as a network technician for a mid-sized data hosting company on the outskirts of Seattle. The facility was a massive, windowless concrete block filled with rows upon rows of server racks. Because the servers generated an immense amount of heat, the cooling systems were always running at maximum capacity, creating a deafening, constant hum that vibrated right through the floorboards and into your teeth. I worked the graveyard shift, meaning from midnight to 8 in the morning. I was entirely alone in a building the size of a football field. For the first few months, it was a dream job. I am an introvert by nature, and the isolation was peaceful. My duties were simple: monitor the network traffic, replace any failing hard drives, and ensure the cooling units didn't malfunction. Most of the time, I sat in the soundproof security booth at the front of the building, reading books or watching movies on my laptop. It wasn't until the second week of November that the peace finally broke. It was around 3 a.m. A warning light flashed on my console, indicating that a server in Sector 4, the furthest corner of the warehouse, was overheating. I grabbed my toolkit, swiped my key card, and stepped out of the booth and into the roaring hum of the server floor. The lighting in the warehouse was motion activated to save electricity. As I walked down the main central aisle, the fluorescent tubes flickered to life just ahead of me, casting long, sharp shadows through the mesh doors of the server racks. As I approached Sector 4, I realized the motion sensors were behaving strangely. The lights 2 aisles over to my left were snapping on, one by one, keeping perfect pace with my own movements. I stopped walking. The lights in my aisle stayed on. The lights in the parallel aisle stopped turning on as well. I took 3 steps forward. Through the narrow gaps between the heavy black metal racks, I saw the lights in the adjacent aisle flicker on 3 times. Someone or something was walking exactly parallel to me, mimicking my pace. I froze, my hand hovering over the heavy metal flashlight on my belt. "Hello?" I called out. My voice was instantly swallowed by the roar of the cooling fans. I waited for a response, but there was only the mechanical drone of the servers. I told myself it was just a glitch in the electrical system. The sensors were old, and the vibrations from the fans often set them off. I forced myself to keep walking until I reached the malfunctioning rack in Sector 4. I opened the mesh door, found the faulty fan unit, and began unscrewing it. That was when I noticed the smell. It was subtle at first, masked by the ozone and warm dust of the electronics. But as I knelt on the grated floor, it became unmistakable. It smelled like unwashed clothes, old sweat, and something metallic, like copper. I shined my flashlight down through the heavy steel grating of the floor. Data centers have raised floors to allow for massive bundles of power cables to run beneath the racks. The space down there is about 3 feet deep, a dark labyrinth of wires and concrete pillars. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness beneath the floor. Nestled between a thick bundle of fiber optic cables and a concrete support beam was a dirty, flattened sleeping bag. Scattered around it were empty food wrappers, a few plastic bottles filled with a dark yellow liquid, and a large, rusted hunting knife. My blood ran cold. The facility was completely locked down. Nobody could get in without a highly restricted key card. I stumbled backward, dropping my screwdriver. It clattered against the grating, the sound piercing through the hum of the servers. Instantly, the lights in the aisle directly behind me snapped on. Then the next row, then the next. The lights were moving rapidly toward the front exit, toward my security booth. I didn't wait. I sprinted in the opposite direction, heading for the emergency fire exit at the back of the building. I slammed my body against the crash bar, bursting out into the freezing night air, and didn't stop running until I reached my car. I locked the doors, called the police, and waited. When the officers arrived, they searched the entire building. They found the sleeping bag, the wrappers, and the knife. They also found something else, a small stolen maintenance key card that granted access to the subfloor panels. The police reviewed the security footage from the cameras mounted above the aisles. They wanted to see how the intruder had managed to evade me. I sat in the manager's office the next morning watching the black and white monitor as the footage played. But the security footage didn't show anyone following me. It showed me following them. Three years ago, I moved into a small, single-story house in a quiet, suburban cul-de-sac in Ohio. After a messy divorce, I just wanted somewhere peaceful to start over. The neighborhood was idyllic. The lawns were perfectly manicured, the streets were lined with old oak trees, and the houses were spaced far enough apart to offer a decent amount of privacy. My house had a large bay window in the living room that looked directly across a narrow strip of lawn to the side of my neighbor's house. The house next door belonged to an elderly man named Mr. Abernathy. I'd only met him once on the day I moved in. He was frail, quiet, and seemed perfectly polite, though he rarely left his home. For the first few weeks, I barely noticed him. I was busy unpacking, painting walls, and trying to make the space feel like my own. But as autumn set in and the days grew shorter, I began to notice a strange routine. Every evening around 7 p.m., I would sit on my living room couch to read or watch television. And every evening without fail, I would look up at my bay window and see a silhouette standing in the window of Mr. Abernathy's house, looking directly into my living room. At first, it didn't bother me. I assumed he was just a lonely old man looking out at the street. But as the weeks turned into months, it became deeply unsettling. He never moved. He would just stand there perfectly still for hours. The lighting in his house was always dim, so I couldn't make out his features clearly, but I could see the pale shape of his face pressed close to the glass. One evening in late November, the streetlights outside flickered and died, plunging the cul-de-sac into an unusual darkness. The only light in my living room was the soft glow of my television. I looked toward the bay window. He was there, as always. But because it was so dark outside, the ambient light from my television illuminated his window just enough for me to see his face clearly for the first time. He was smiling. It wasn't a gentle, neighborly smile. It was a wide, unnatural, ear-to-ear grin that stretched his features into a grotesque mask. His eyes were wide open, unblinking, locked entirely on me. A cold knot of genuine fear tightened in my stomach. I stood up from the couch and took a step toward the window. The smile didn't waver. I closed the blinds, my hands shaking slightly, and locked the front door. I told myself I was overreacting. He was just an eccentric old man. But the image of that wide, unblinking smile was burned into my mind. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I decided I had to do something. I couldn't live in constant anxiety in my own home. I baked a small batch of cookies, walked over to his front door, and rang the bell. I planned to introduce myself, properly and politely ask for some privacy. I waited on the porch for 5 minutes. No one answered. I knocked harder, leaning closer to the heavy wooden door. The house was completely silent. I walked around the side of the house, stepping over overgrown weeds, until I reached the window that faced my living room. I wanted to see what room he had been standing in. I cupped my hands around my eyes and peered through the dusty glass. The room inside was completely empty. There was no furniture, no carpets, no curtains, just bare floorboards covered in a thick layer of undisturbed dust. I frowned, confused. I looked closer at the floorboards right in front of the window. There were no footprints in the dust. No one had stood in that room for months. A terrible, sinking realization hit me as I looked back at my own house, at my own large bay window reflecting the gray morning sky. The angle was wrong. The distance was wrong. I called the police for a wellness check on Mr. Abernathy, who they found had passed away peacefully in his upstairs bedroom over a month prior. When the police asked me why I had called, I couldn't speak. I realized then that the pale, smiling face I had been seeing every night wasn't looking out from the house next door. I had been looking at the reflection of the man standing directly behind me in the dark. My job as an agricultural inspector requires me to drive long, isolated stretches of highway across the American Midwest. I am used to the dark. I am used to the endless miles of empty asphalt, the hypnotic rhythm of the dashed yellow lines, and the complete solitude of the night shift. I never minded the driving until one specific night in October of 2019, on a desolate stretch of Route 83 in western Nebraska. It was a little past 2 a.m. There was no moon, and the sky was a heavy, suffocating blanket of black clouds. I hadn't seen another vehicle for over an hour, and the only light came from my headlights, cutting through the darkness and the faint green glow of my dashboard. I was listening to a podcast, nursing a lukewarm cup of gas station coffee, when I noticed the headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, it was comforting to have some company on the road. The car was about a quarter mile behind me, maintaining a steady speed. I was cruising at exactly 65 miles per hour. I watched the headlights in the mirror for a few minutes, then looked back at the road. 10 minutes passed. I checked the mirror again. The car hadn't closed the distance, nor had it fallen behind. It was maintaining the exact same gap, matching my speed flawlessly. Just to test the waters, I gently eased off the accelerator, dropping my speed to 55. I watched the mirror. The headlights behind me didn't approach. The other driver had slowed down too, keeping the exact same distance. A prickle of unease ran down my neck. I pressed the gas, accelerating up to 80 miles per hour. The engine roared. The wind hissed against the windows. I checked the mirror. The headlights were still there, exactly a quarter mile back. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was a straight, empty highway. Maybe the driver was just using adaptive cruise control and had locked onto my car to zone out. But the feeling of being hunted began to take root in my chest. Up ahead, my GPS indicated a small, unlit rest stop, just a gravel pull-off with a few trash cans. I decided to pull over and let the car pass. I signaled, slowed down, and guided my truck onto the crunching gravel, throwing it into park. I kept my foot on the brake, lighting up the area behind me with my tail lights, and watched the mirror. The headlights of the approaching car grew larger, brighter. I waited for them to speed past in the left lane, but they didn't. As the car approached the rest stop, it hit its brakes. It pulled onto the gravel about 50 yards behind me, and then the headlights turned off. My breath caught in my throat. I sat in the pitch-black cabin of my truck, staring into the dark rear-view mirror. I couldn't see the car anymore, but I knew it was there, sitting in the dark, watching me. I reached over and locked my doors. My phone had no signal out here. I was completely alone. 5 agonizing minutes passed in total silence. I stared into the darkness until my eyes watered, waiting for a door to open, for a figure to emerge. Nothing happened. I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed the truck into drive, hit the gas, and tore out of the gravel lot back onto the highway. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I pushed the truck up to 90 miles per hour, desperate to put distance between us. I checked the mirror constantly. The highway behind me remained completely dark. The other car hadn't followed. I drove for another 2 hours until I reached a well-lit 24-hour truck stop near the state line. I pulled into a spot right under a harsh halogen street lamp, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. I let out a massive sigh of relief, unbuckled my seatbelt, and stepped out of the truck to get some fresh air. As I walked around to the back of my vehicle to stretch my legs, I stopped dead in my tracks. The heavy metal lid of my truck's bed canopy, which I always kept locked, was unlatched. It was propped open just a few inches. The lock cylinder had been quietly drilled out. I backed away slowly, the blood draining from my face as I realized the horrible truth about the dark stretch of highway. The other driver hadn't been hunting me. He had been trying to warn me about the man who was already inside my truck. If these stories kept you awake, make sure to hit that subscribe button and leave a like. Have you ever experienced something you couldn't explain? Tell me in the comments below. Turn on notifications so you never miss a scare. Until next time, keep your doors locked.